Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known fascinating facts and figures behind your favorite movies, music, TV shows, and more. We are your two Nazi-hating, snake-fearing, artifact-recovering, whip-toting Raiders of the Lost podcast. My name is Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. That's very good.
Well, I didn't get the alliteration in there, but I wanted to still have a little bit of that rat-a-tat-tat rhythm.
I'm not one of those things, but I'll let you figure out which one.
Today we're talking about possibly the greatest action-adventure movie of all time, the devastating right cross and the 1-2 jab of iconic characters played by Harrison Ford, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas's collaborative love letter to the matinee icons of their youth. That's right, we're talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm told there's a new movie in the Indiana Jones franchise out, which is shocking to me because it ended in 1989.
You like seeing him get blown up by an atomic bomb while hiding in a fridge in Crystal Skull? It didn't do it for you?
Didn't do it. Damn thing for me. Much like everything, really, the tide of critical reappraisal has come back around to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
Has it really?
Oh, yeah. There's defenders for that movie online. Those people are wrong. It's one of those, I guess if you evaluate it on its merits, it's fine, but it's just something that didn't need to exist and looks like hideously dated. And then in the new one...
Are you going to see the new one?
No.
Really?
No, I don't give a shit.
Oh.
3 perfect to pretty incredibly good films. I don't need to see the 5th one. This movie is going to things up for Disney and probably just for Disney, really, because I forget they own Lucasfilm and everybody, but this is one of the most expensive movies ever made, Indy 5. It was in development for so long. It cost like $300 million. And that was, I think, before marketing.
Oh, my God. So $500 million.
Yeah, they're taking a bath on it. And good. I like James Mangold, the director. He did my favorite Wolverine movie.
Which one's that?
Logan, which is actually a beautiful, elegiac film that with shades of like Unforgiven and really, really, really great stuff. But yeah, no, I everyone involved in this movie, with the exception of Harrison Ford, can go screw. Maybe even Harrison Ford.
No, wait, what about, you can't say that about Marion, though.
She's in it for like 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, but she's still in it. Karen Allen's amazing.
Karen Allen is great. Everything about it pisses me off. They added just like a new character. And there's like a whole, it's all just the CGI garbage. There's the de-aging. It's just, they had such an opportunity to do something actually like cool with it. And then everything that I've heard about it, and yes, I also Wikipedia'd the plot because I'm not going to see it. Even the ending of it is like a cop-out. You have to edit all this out, but like, do you know? Well, you're going to see it. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but like the ending is like a saccharine cop-out,
which means I'll love it.
Probably, yeah.
It takes place in the 60s. It's got Indiana Jones. It's got a saccharine ending. I'm going to love it. What are you talking about?
I don't know that there's too much 60s stuff other than just like the opening where they're like, the opening is
the
de-aged,
parade?
is de-aged. No, the opening is de-aged him on a train that somebody more than one person compared it to Polar Express though, based on how bad the CGI is.
Wait, is it like the RFK funeral train?
No, it opens up with like a flashback, and that's where you have like really de-aged Indy because it's still Harrison, but it's like it's got like Toby Jones and the main villain, and it's a flashback in World War II, and it takes place on a train, and then they fast forward to 1969 where he's like retiring and he hates the Beatles. Well, I think they wake him, like there's like he gets like woken up by somebody playing, I think Magical Mystery Tour is like a bit that I read. Anyway, I'm spoiling this whole movie for you, which is what you deserve because it's a piece of cash grab and I hate it.
But these
Raiders
first
of the
three.
Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a perfect film though. It's fitting that the last movie in this trilogy was about eternal youth, the promise of eternal youth, because this is like one of those movies where it just gives you that like youthful rush of being a kid, like playing in your backyard again, you know? And I saw it when I was like 6, and it's just instantly you're just like, Like, you have this dim glimmer in the back of your head that, like, this isn't a real thing. Like, even as a child, I was like, this is not archaeologists don't do this. Because I was also a dinosaur kid, so I
was a
knew
historian,
what archaeologists actually do. And so I was like, this is just the coolest thing, and this like sense of adventure and this, you know, golly gee whiz, wide-eyed, the good guys can defeat the Nazis with a really good punch and get the girl, and just all this great stuff. It's just one of the purest like distillations of that feeling in all of cinema, and I'm glad it hits the same. I'd be very sad if I went and revisited this, other than all the kind of, you know, white savior stuff and blah blah blah. But other than some of the like things that we look at with like a progressive lens now, we're like, that hasn't aged so well, but still a perfect film.
Yeah, I mean, you were a dinosaur kid. I was, that should come as no surprise, a very indoor history buff nerd, even as a little boy. I remember in preschool, the bully was teasing or being mean to a little girl I liked at recess or playing in the backyard. And I remember running up to him and like getting uncharacteristically like pseudo-physical with him and being like, let her go. Because I think I heard Harrison Ford say that in one of these movies. So that's my main memory of, it must have been Raiders. But damn, I do love these movies. Although, I mean, as I'm sure we've talked about this a lot, I'm more of a Last Crusade guy as opposed to a Raiders or a Temple of Doom. Mostly due to my undying allegiance to Sean Connery, who, it's worth mentioning, when The Last Crusade premiered in 1989, he was 58. Harrison Ford is 80, and he just attended the premiere of the new movie. That's insane.
Yeah. Yeah. And Harrison Ford will still punch you in the face, too, for looking at him cross-eyed.
Ask Ryan Gosling. Yeah, Raiders, I haven't really revisited this movie as much. Last Crusade is something that I still watch, like, every couple years. But, yeah, Raiders, I'm glad to hear that it does hold up, because it's been a minute since I've seen it.
It's just great because it doesn't have any of the baggage. Like, even though they made this as a 3-picture deal, which is wild to me, that they were like, they must have been really gassed on their I mean, and rightly so.
I mean,
you know, Spielberg had made Jaws and Close Encounters, and Lucas had made 2 Star Wars. But to make a 3-picture deal right out of the gate on this, but this is the one that doesn't have the baggage, you know? Immediately by the time you get to Temple of Doom, they're already self-referencing, they're already like toying with the iconography, and then by the time you get to, you know, Crusade, it is a little freighted with its own
myth.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas this one is just such a like clean, no nonsense film.
What do you think about Temple of Doom? I feel like that's the one,
the most divorced guy movie ever. It's fascinating. Lucas was getting divorced, and that's why it's so mean. And Spielberg, I think, was in the process of getting divorced and was like trying to date Kate Capshaw. But it's so like dark and violent, and you know, I mention this later on, but it's actually interesting because it adds this shade to Indy's character, where he returns the thing that the MacGuffin to the people at the end, which is I think something that gets overlooked in the mythology of the characters. That there's like an explicit moment where he's like, "No, this does not belong in a museum," which is really funny. But yeah, that movie's weird. It opens with a musical number. It opens with him in like a white dinner jacket, a la James Bond. It's just very, very bizarre. And that's what I mean. Like, they were already just kind of like high on their own supply by that point. This one is almost like punk in its like manic energy and the way that it was done on such a shoestring. We're putting the cart to the head of the horse here. Well, from the exact model and species of animal that Indy's whip is made from, to Harrison Ford's dogged insistence on placing himself in various shades of peril for the film, to how they pulled off that horrifying face melt at the end. You forgot about the face melt?
Yeah, I did.
Here's everything you didn't know about Raiders of the Lost Ark. In a way, we got Raiders of the Lost Ark from Francis Ford Coppola. George Lucas explained to Vanity Fair that early on in his involvement with Coppola on Apocalypse Now, Coppola told him, "For your next film, why don't you try something funny, warm and fuzzy?" And he was working on Apocalypse Now with John Milius. And early in that film's development, it was kind of like a Dr. Strangelove satire. And Lucas was like, this isn't really coming together. And he decides to make American Graffiti instead. But by his own admission, he's working on a few different ideas at the time. One of them is what he called to the American Film Institute, the idea of kind of taking a 30s serial using mythology and ideas from the past and creating an adventure film. He's talked before about wanting to make Flash Gordon. You know, he wanted to originally make an adaptation of Flash Gordon, but he couldn't get the rights. Then he just kind of took the idea of a space opera serial and did all of the stuff that he stole from Kurosawa films to create Star Wars, right? But he also had this idea that he shelved, the idea for Indiana Jones that he shelved in favor of making Star Wars. But before that even happened, he was kicking this idea around and developing it with a guy named Phil Kaufman, who's a director and writer who's best known for his adaptation of The Unbearable Lightness of Being, the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and The Right Stuff. And it's from Phil Kaufman that we actually get the Lost Ark of the Covenant idea, this so-called MacGuffin. Lawrence Kasdan, who is the other big three of this film, said that Kaufman's orthodontist told him the legend of the Ark of the Covenant when he was 11 years old, which seems like a weird thing for a guy messing around in your mouth to do. Kaufman was actually supposed to direct. Lucas wanted him to direct the project, but he abandoned this to go direct Clint Eastwood in The Outlaw Josie Wales, figuring it was a smart decision at the time that, hey, Clint Eastwood is making a Western. Clint Eastwood's a big star. Westerns are big genres. My other choice is George Lucas and his adventure serial thing that is completely unproven. So, fast forward to 1977.
Before we go to 1977, I didn't realize that George Lucas was involved with Apocalypse Now. What was his involvement? Just like an early draft of it with Francis Ford Coppola?
Yeah, and John Milius. Milius is the guy widely credited with the surf characters. These are all Bay Area guys. Like Coppola lives in Napa. Like, Lucas has always been in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. He's in Skywalker's in Marin. And they were, I don't know what the exact connection is, but they, I think, might have been like kind of known through the USC film network. Anyway, yeah, he did a draft of Apocalypse Now, but he left pretty early on. But
I love hearing stories of these guys who all went to school together and knew each other. It's like the Al Gore, Tommy Lee Jones roommate thing from Harvard. I love that.
Well, there's that great book, Easy Riders,
Raging Bulls.
Yeah. Yeah, they're loosely grouped under the heading of New Hollywood. I guess Coppola was actually like somewhat of a mentor to him. Oh, yeah. What am I saying? They co-founded American Zoetrope together. That's their relationship. American Zoetrope is a privately run production company that Coppola has funded all of his stuff through now. It was created for The Rain People, which was his first movie in 1969. And then Zoetrope financed THX 1138 and American Graffiti. So cut all that hemming and hawing that I did. That's their relationship. And Lucas was working on Apocalypse Now with him and John Milius.
Johnny Carson voice. I did not know that. Thank you.
Moving on to 1977.
Yes, back to Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Steven Spielberg is taking his customary post-picture vacation in Hawaii, having just wrapped Close Encounters of the Third Kind, while George Lucas was basically there in hiding. He was terrified that Star Wars was going to be a flop, so he was hiding out in Hawaii. Steven Spielberg told The Guardian in 2021, George and I happened to be in Hawaii at the same time. Apparently they were building a sandcastle together, which, if that's true, and I choose to believe it is adorable, but also a beautiful metaphor for what was to come.
Ooh, yeah.
Ooh, yeah. See, yeah. And then Disney would be the wave that would crash and carry it all out, I guess. Spielberg continued, we started complaining to one another about the problems you get making these big films. He'd tell me about his difficulties with the robots on Star Wars, and I'd tell him about my nightmare stories about the mechanical shark in Jaws, which he named Bruce after his lawyer. Then I mentioned I'd always wanted to make a James Bond picture, and George said, I've got something better than Bond. He told me the plot of Raiders, and he said the very best thing would be we wouldn't have to make a single piece of hardware in the film. And Spielberg, I guess he really, really wanted to make a Bond film so bad, which is also kind of adorable. But he was turned down by James Bond producer Albert Cubby Broccoli twice, not once, but twice. First for being too unknown, and then the second time because Broccoli assumed that he'd be too expensive now that he was the biggest director in Hollywood.
Really the catch, the in between the rock and a hard place of like not getting to do your dream project. First it's because you're not big enough, and then it's because you're too big.
What about now, though? I feel like I bet you in our lifetime, or rather his lifetime, there will be one Spielberg-directed Bond movie. Do we think it'll be good? It'll be a reboot one. No, yeah.
No, he's only going to do one if he can make it all sad and about his parents and about movies and the stories we tell and who gets to tell them and all that other highfalutin crap.
I mean, we got a reboot coming up for Bond. Maybe we got to know more about Bond's backstory with his parents. That could be great. Or it could be what the franchise needs?
Question mark?
I mean, Bond in a post-woke Bond? We're going to delve into his trauma.
I guess you're right, actually.
I know.
If he makes new pitch. Get Steven Spielberg to do Meet the Fablemans style Bond movie.
Meet the Bonds.
With no action and no set pieces.
Bonds by blood. There we go. That's it.
Ooh. Nice.
Thank you. Anyway, but Spielberg, having failed to secure a Bond film, inserted all sorts of little nods to 007 into the Indiana Jones franchise. From having Indy appear in a white tux in the opening to Temple of Doom, which you just mentioned, to having James Bond himself, Sean Connery, play Indy's dad in The Last Crusade. What is his dad's name in those movies?
Henry Jones.
Yes. No, that's what he calls Indy's name. That's what he calls Indy.
Yeah, you're right. Junior. No, it is Henry Jones. Yeah, Henry.
Oh, so you're
right.
Oh, Junior?
Henry Jones
Yeah.
Senior. And Junior.
Yeah.
So Lawrence Kasdan comes onto the project next, and that happens because Spielberg purchased Kasdan's script for a film called Continental Divide, and these guys sit down for what is over like a week of hour-long days of brainstorming. But let me set the stage for that first. Kasdan said in the fourth entry of the Backstory book series by a guy named Patrick McGilligan, George had already had the idea of the way that Indy dressed, and Phil Kaufman had provided the MacGuffin of the Lost Ark of the Covenant. So we sat down and decided on what kind of hero Indiana Jones would be. His name, his whip, talked about the MacGuffin in serial films. After that, we created the film by jumping through our favorite moments from those kinds of films, the sort of thing we'd really like to see. But Jordan, what is a MacGuffin?
Yes, I'm glad you asked, Heigl. The phrase MacGuffin, it's a cinematic device. The term is generally accredited to Alfred Hitchcock for an object around which the plot of a movie revolves, but it doesn't really have any intrinsic value otherwise. And a great example of a MacGuffin in the sort of more modern era is the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, which I don't think we ever learn what's in the briefcase. So it's kind of the perfect MacGuffin. You don't even know what it is. Alfred Hitchcock explained the genesis of the term MacGuffin in a 1939 lecture at Columbia University, saying, "It might be a Scottish name taken from a story about two men on a train. One man says, 'What's that package up there in the baggage rack?' And the other answers, 'Oh, that's a MacGuffin.' The first one asks, 'What's a MacGuffin?' 'Well,' the other man says, 'it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands.' The first man says, 'But there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands.' And the other one answers, 'Well then, that's no MacGuffin.' So you see, a MacGuffin is actually nothing at all. So I guess it's based around an old vaudeville joke, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Gotcha. Well, this is a really fascinating thing that I uncovered doing this. There's a recording of one of these brainstorming sessions that these guys did. Lawrence Kasdan, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas. And someone transcribed it. So you can actually go and read the entire live processing of their brains as they fleshed out the character and the first movie. This took
you
place
can't hear it?
What's that?
I'd love to hear it as opposed to reading it. It's not on YouTube?
Sure, it might be. No, I think it's just a transcript. I don't think the recording is up. But yeah, they did this at the Sherman Oaks apartment of Lucas's assistant, because George Lucas doesn't live in LA and hates it. But it's got all these amazing quotes in it. Spielberg says at one point, Each cliffhanger is better than the one before. What we're doing here really is designing a ride at Disneyland. They name drop all of these influences for Indy, from like Bond and Clint Eastwood to Alan Quatermain, who's a old timey adventurer, and then less obvious ones like Clark Gable. They pretty much, I don't think I have this pinned down, but they pretty much pin the ID that the way Indy dresses is like Humphrey Bogart in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, the leather jacket, the felt hat, the khakis. And that look actually comes together thanks to a famous comic book artist named Jim Steranko, who was commissioned to do these 4 paintings of Indy based on these descriptions from Lucas and Spielberg and Kasdan. And he delivers these paintings to them in August 1979, less than 2 months after getting the prompts. They're these beautiful Men's Health style like oil paintings that are have like, Indy with like on a tank and like punching a Nazi, and everyone should Google them. They're beautiful. But in this transcript, in this recording, Lucas very succinctly just sketches out the second act of the movie. He says, in essence, it's just bullshit stuff where he wanders around Cairo trying to uncover the mystery of his puzzle. And at the same time, you meet all these interesting characters, and every once in a while, someone throws a knife at him, or he beats somebody up, or somebody beats him up. Typical Middle Eastern stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of casual othering that happens in there. There's like, they talk about like, oh, well, we want that Oriental influence. So like guys and like Middle Eastern guys, like, thin mustaches and scimitars. And it's like, oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the whole unspoken part about this is that these adventure serials that they were like modeling this stuff off are wildly racist. So there's that. And it's in this recording you hear, and I've heard a couple different versions of this, but it's in this transcript. You also see there's a line in here. God, how do I want to phrase this? I should just read what I wrote. The name Indiana comes from George Lucas's Alaskan Malamute dog that also inspired the character of Chewbacca.
Whoa.
And that's why they put it in the third film. We named the dog Indy.
Hope they stuff that dog and have it on display at Skywalker Ranch. Jesus.
Right next to the Ark of the Covenant.
In the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, yeah. So he, in this transcript, though, and at this session, Lucas refers to him as Indiana Smith. Ew. And then, they immediately backtrack it. And he's like, or something else, like Jones. And then everyone can call him Jones. And I've also heard that Lucas stuck to this until like very late in the development process, and it was Spielberg who hated the name, correctly surmising that people would see it as a very obvious ripoff of the 1966 Steve McQueen film Nevada Smith. So they lobbied for Indiana Jones instead, which is less blatant of a ripoff, but a ripoff none the same. But hilariously, all of this fun brainstorming did not help get the actual script written. And Lawrence Kasdan told Empire magazine, when I started, I was intimidated, but I realized the reason they hired me was they wanted someone to do all the hard work, put it all together, and come up with all the connective material. They had all these great set pieces in mind, but that's different from a screenplay. I actually wrote it in Steven's office while he was making 1941. Speaking of 1941, Jordan, tell us why Steven Spielberg was in a downturn when he made Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, you mentioned this at the top of the episode that Raiders of the Lost Ark was made on a relative shoestring. What, 20 million? Which
20 mil.
But still, I mean, considering the scope of it is pretty impressive. It's because Spielberg made a little movie called 1941 with John Belushi is about all I know about it, and the fact that it's supposed to be very bad. And it was extremely costly and underperformed in a big way or a small way. Do you underperform in a big way or a small way?
That's a great question.
Yeah, questions for our time. Okay. Spielberg later told The Guardian, after 1941, I got fed up with endless expensive productions. Afterwards, I went back and looked at my favorite films from the 30s and 40s and thought how quickly and cheaply they were made. I think I'm basically a reincarnated director from the 1930s. I'd watch that. Raiders owes a lot to the Tarzan books, the Amazing Adventures, the pre-comic book books of that era. It was kind of a whiz-bang time. And in
if I were that interviewer, I would have gone, Leni Riefenstahl?
And in that recorded brainstorming meeting that you mentioned, George Lucas hammers down this whole budgetary thing. He said, we have to figure out a way of making this cheap, meaning $6 or $7 million. And we want to spend our money on stunts. For production value and entertainment value, it's much better to have a terrific stunt than to have a scene with 8,000 extras.
You got to do it in the George Lucas deadpan voice. We have to figure out a way of making this cheap, meaning $6 or $7 million. Just the most uninteresting man in the world.
Well, at the time of Indiana Jones, I didn't realize this. George Lucas had retired from directing and even retired as a producer because he'd nearly lost everything that he had on the second Star Wars film, The Empire Strikes Back. He told Vanity Fair that nearly every major studio had turned down Raiders, partly because of his projected $20 million budget, and partly because Lucas was driving a very hard deal. He learned a lot of lessons from the Star Wars experience, retaining licensing rights and creative control. And Michael Eisner was the president of Paramount at the time. He eventually caved to his demands, but his biggest concern was actually Spielberg directing. Lucas recalled, Steve had just come off of 3 giant, huge, mega disaster movies. 1941, Close Encounters, and Jaws. I think the disaster is referring to the plot line and not they weren't all bombs. Both went double over budget, double over schedule. Of course, he was forgiven over Jaws because it was a mega hit. He was sort of forgiven over Close Encounters because it was a big hit, but 1941 was not, and therefore they don't forgive anymore, which is all you need to know about Hollywood and the film industry. And I talked with Steven because he was a friend of mine. He was caught in some circumstances beyond his control. And I said, we'll just do this very lightly. We'll do it like television, which I think they both had their start in, or at least Spielberg did. And these are the rules, and this is how we're going to play. And Spielberg agreed. And so I had complete confidence in him.
Yeah, they called it Lucas's killer deal because this thing was so like creator friendly and hard driving. Both of them got points. They got their fee, but both of them got points. And obviously licensing and all those rights. Like it's insane for something that was based on completely original property from a guy who had just had a huge flop. You know, I think it was definitely Lucas's clout that got this because he was fresh off of. Even though Empire had almost bankrupted him, he didn't. That was still another big hit, and I think he had kind of the clout to push it in a way that, or at least residual stuff from the first Star Wars that enabled them to drive this.
Why did it almost bankrupt him? I know that's a whole other episode, but
I think they just. I don't know. I'm completely speculating, but I don't know. I think he might have just tried to. It might have just gone way over budget. Because I think that's the one where... Is that the one where Mark Hamill got like a car accident in between the first two and that pushed back shooting? And yeah, Empire Strikes Back was one of the most expensive films of its day. $33 million. And the bank threatened to pool his loan, so he had to go to 20th Century Fox to get the rest floated.
Whoa.
It was initially budgeted at $18 million, which was 50% more than the first Star Wars. But yeah.
That's hilarious that $33 million was the most expensive movie at the time. I mean, I know it was 1979, but Jesus.
Now 50 years later we have one
that's a rom-com.
Half
$1
billion with marketing. Good God. We live in hell.
So you've got Spielberg directing, you've got George Lucas writing. What all he do?
Got sunburned.
They still needed a producer. So they got Frank Marshall on board to keep things under budget, or at least try. And Paramount, the studio, insisted on severe penalties if the film went over its $20 million budget. And one way Spielberg managed to keep things a little bit trimmer was he used stock footage. It's just kind of adorable. The shots of the DC-3 flying over the Himalayas is lifted from 1973's Lost Horizon, while a 1930s street scene was borrowed from 1975's The Hindenburg.
Just love the fact that he was penny pinching to the point where he was like, yeah, stock footage. That's the other reason they do the, the classic...
the maps.
Yes, the script originally called for montages. They were going to have him bouncing around street scenes in all of these places. I love
those maps.
Yeah, and they were like, no, that's not, sorry, bud, that's not happening. So they just did the line bouncing around on the map.
That's the best part. That bit, it's so perfect. It's exactly, it makes the movie, it's whiz-bang, if I may.
Whiz-bang,
exactly. Term, yeah.
So, For the film's lead, George Lucas told Empire, "I was wary of Harrison and I becoming like Scorsese and De Niro. I thought, let's create a new icon. We found Tom Selleck, but as soon as the network heard, his option on Magnum PI got picked up." Lucas told Total Film, the show, Magnum PI, had sat there and nobody wanted it. We were desperate to get going. We called CBS and asked if he could be let out of his option agreement. It literally had 10 days to go. So that's one of the most famous bits of trivia about this movie, and you can actually see Selleck in like screen test. You can see him in the costume for it. I mean, it got that close to the wire. But he was hardly the only guy that they had floated for this. Pretty much every brunette male in Hollywood seemingly was floated for this role at one point. Chevy Chase and Bill Murray.
Bill Murray?
They wanted the humor thing in there. They wanted him to be kind of wisecracking. They didn't necessarily want like a big He-Man character. Harrison Ford was actually kind of scrawny coming off Han Solo, and they actually made him. He like went and worked out a bunch for this. Nick Nolte, Steve Martin, Tim Matheson from Animal House, men who I don't know named Nick Mancuso and Peter Coyote.
Peter Coyote's Ken Burns' narrator voice.
Incredible. Jack Nicholson, Jeff Bridges, John Shea, Sam Elliott, and Harry Hamlin were all in the running. I think the casting director liked Jeff Bridges the most. But the ultimate indignity for Tom Selleck would be that the 1980 actors' strike put Magnum PI on hiatus for 3 months, which would have allowed for him to star as Indiana Jones and do Magnum PI.
What do you think of all these almosts?
Jeff Bridges would have been great.
I'm in the Nicholson.
Sam Elliott probably would have been pretty good too. Sam Elliott's that man's a fine piece of ass with a great voice. So he's a snack. My God, him in Roadhouse. That is a hot old dude, and he would have been young. He's probably scorching in this era.
You love a mustache, don't you? Oh yeah, okay. You know what? I take it back. You're right.
Oh yeah, he looks like Clint Eastwood. He's got that. Yeah, man. Without the mustache, he looks like a matinee idol.
He kind of looks a little bit like Glenn Fry.
How dare you?
Which kind of throws me.
Why would you bring that into this?
It does. It's just like.
So with literal weeks left to go before they started shooting, and with them being without a star, Spielberg was at a screening of The Empire Strikes Back, and he called George Lucas. And he was like, "I think the answer's been under our noses this entire time." And Lucas wasn't sure that Harrison would sign on for a 3-picture deal, with also being contracted for the third Star Wars. And Ford, when he did sign on, got quite the deal. He got 7 figures, 7% of the gross, and he got to come in and rewrite all of the dialogue because, in his own inimitable words, "I don't want to be playing Professor Solo here." So he wanted to come in and just throw out a lot of the dialogue and put his own spin on it. But he threw himself into the role. He worked out extensively to get in shape, and he trained with a bullwhip coach. Guy came to his house, and they practiced with the bullwhip to get Indy's iconic weapon down. Ford did a boatload of stunts for this film without managing to severely injure himself, but he did tear his ACL. He explained this in a 2014 Reddit AMA. He says he can't remember which knee, but it's the scene when he's fighting the German mechanic on that airplane called the Flying Wing. It actually ran over him at one point, and it didn't run over his knee. It ran over his, I think, foot and ankle. But the only thing that saved him was because they were shooting in Tunisia, and the macadam or whatever had become so soft and was already covered by sand that when the landing gear rolled over his foot, it pressed it down into the ground, and they were able to roll it off him. But he still tore his ACL doing this.
He can't remember which one, presumably because he's torn both of them multiple times, is my guess.
Yeah. And then he, for that another, probably the high water mark of the movie in terms of pure action, the truck chase, he was actually dragged behind the moving truck for some of those shots, and he bruised some ribs in that. There's a book by a guy named J.W. Rinsler called The Complete Making of Indiana Jones. And in that, he outlines how Steven Spielberg and the stuntman Terry Leonard designed that truck chase, and specifically the part where Indy is underneath the truck, as an homage to the stunt work of a guy with the fantastic name of Yakima Kanut, who pulled off similar feats using horses and a stagecoach in 1939's Stagecoach and the serial Zorro's Fighting Legion. Terry Leonard almost died trying to recreate that stunt for a movie called The Legend of the Lone Ranger in 1981. And he played the truck's original driver, and then he doubled for Ford when Indy is underneath the truck and in some of the scenes where he's being dragged behind it. Stunt coordinator named Glenn Randall Jr., who I believe is the guy whose whip it was. That guy drove the vehicle. And the truck was designed to accommodate it. They lifted it up, obviously to give as much clearance underneath it, but they also dug out a trench underneath it so that he could be both sunken into the ground and the truck be super high up above it, which you can see in the shots. And then when Harrison is in front of the truck, he's on a bike seat, when he's like trying to climb up the hood and the Mercedes-Benz hood ornament snaps off, which some people have interpreted as being a jab at the company for being loathsome Nazi collaborators. But he's like, they just rigged like a bicycle seat to come out of the undercarriage, and like he sat on it and pretended to scrabble around on the hood while the thing was moving. As Spielberg recalled in Paul Honeyford's biography of Harrison Ford, there are 4 or 5 very risky scenes that Terry Leonard, J.R. Randall, and Vic Armstrong did for him. J.R. Randall was our stunt gaffer, and he wouldn't let Harrison do any stunts that were potentially fatal. But Harrison did most everything else. Anything that simply promised serious injury or total disability, Harrison did. Anything that promised death through fatal miscalculation, Terry, Vic, and J.R. did.
You think they get a better term than stunt gaffer? Because to me, that just sounds like a guy who's always screwing up stunts. Gaffer.
We still
sounds
have
like a Norm Macdonald joke, but I mean it.
We still have one of the most well-used terms in the film industry is best boy. So grading on a curve here. One of the film's iconic scenes that actually did not injure Ford, but could have, was the boulder chase at the top of the film. Spielberg wrote in an American cinematographer retrospective that we went to great lengths to make a 12-foot rock out of fiberglass and wood and plaster, precisely so that it wouldn't weigh as much as a real 12-foot boulder. But whether it weighed 300 pounds, which it did, or whether it weighed 80 tons, as it would have, it could have still done bodily harm to anyone falling beneath it, and Harrison was not doubled in those scenes. Not only that, but the sequence was shot in the second week of principal photography in London. The absolute worst time to eliminate your leading man is in the second week, but because The Rock was more effective chasing Harrison with Harrison running toward camera, it just didn't work as well having him doubled. A double would have cheated with his head down, so Harrison volunteered to do it himself. He succeeded. There were 5 shots of The Rock from 5 different angles, each one done separately, each one done twice, so Harrison had to race The Rock 10 times. He won 10 times and beat the odds. He was lucky, and I was an idiot for letting him try it.
So he would risk a man's life to get a preferable camera angle. Am I understanding this properly?
That's why he's the best. That's why it's him and Jim Cameron, baby. Total disregard for human life in the pursuit of art. We stan. The sound effects for that boulder were created by, fun fact, iconic sound designer Ben Burtt, who is the guy who does all of the sound effects in Star Wars, the lightsaber noise, the TIE fighter, that noise. Sorry.
Whoa. Wow. That was good.
Sorry for doing that without prompting you. He's also the voice of Wall-E. How awesome of a CV does that guy have? Anyway, the sound of the bowler is him just rolling his Honda Civic over his gravel driveway.
In my mind, I just hear like a bowling ball.
Yeah. Also that. As Vic Armstrong told Newsweek, if Harrison wasn't such a great actor, he would have made a really great stuntman. Indy's Whip is a 450 series, that is the name of it, kangaroo leather bullwhip made by David Morgan, a company that is still making these things.
So kangaroo leather, it's made from kangaroos.
It's just what it sounds like, just what it says on the tin.
Wow.
However, in the original film, they couldn't do that because there was an embargo on certain animal products. So I believe some of the original ones in this first film are not actually kangaroo leather. Sorry to disappoint all you kangaroo haters out there. They made about 30 for the original trilogy, ranging in length from 6 to 16 feet. And Harrison had fallen off of a ladder while doing carpentry or painting work early on in his career, and so he had broke his wrist. And due to that injury, he had to basically figure out how to, like a different way, really, to work the bullwhip. And although he did, by his own admission, hit himself in the face and shoulders and head quite a bit while training, he got good enough with the thing. That shot where he whips the gun out of the guy's hand, that was real. Harrison Ford actually did that. And the guy playing that character, who I think appears twice in the movie, there's a bunch of people who were in this movie twice because they were, pinching pennies. And that guy said to Empire magazine, "For that scene in the jungle where Indy whips away my gun, I'm standing there aiming it, and Spielberg says, 'Don't move.' It's my hand, damn it. It's scary, and the risk is there because all Harrison has to do is come half an inch forward to hit my hand." But he never did. So for Jones's look, there's a costume designer who, at the time, her name was Deborah Nadoolman, and she has since married John Landis. So her name is now Deborah Nadoolman Landis. Yeah.
Huh.
Yes. So for the non-weaponry parts of Jones's look, costume designer Deborah Nadoolman Landis has said in various interviews that his wardrobe came from Charlton Heston in 1954's Secret of the Incas and a 1943 movie entitled simply China, starring Alan Ladd. It's hard to Google because it's just called China, but if you look it up and on the poster, guy looks just like Indiana Jones. She sourced 10 leather jackets for Indy from Wilson's House of Suede and Leather in Los Angeles. They custom made these based on a prototype that she made, but when they arrived, they just fell apart. She said they were too low quality for them to use. And so she actually, because the budget on this was so tightly controlled, she had to have Ford go to production and say they needed another 10. So that came together at the legendary London costumier Bermans and Nathans.
You know who Berman and Nathans also provided costumes for?
Who's that?
The Beatles. They provided the Sgt. Pepper costumes for the album cover.
Excellent.
I can always bring it back to the Beatles.
You
I
sure
really
can,
should make that a moment of every episode.
The hat, meanwhile, came from another iconic London spot, New Bond Street's Herbert Johnson. Landis told Deadline, "I had gone to Herbert Johnson and they had nothing to suit. Absolutely nothing. No brown fedoras. But they did have a hat which was called the Australian. Think Crocodile Dundee. It was up on one side and had a very large brim. So I said, I'll have that one. We remade it. So they had to age all of this gear up, though. And so the first night of filming, when they got to France, she told Town and Country magazine, "The first night we were in La Rochelle, after dinner I went down to the pool. I had brought sandpaper, Fuller's Earth, mineral oil, a steel brush. Harrison came and sat with me, and we just drank, and I aged the jackets and the hats."
I can't believe they left it to the night before. You think you'd want to get that squared away before you're on the set.
I've also heard apocryphally that Harrison used his own pocket knife to help age the jackets, which is great.
I believe it. He was a carpenter.
Yeah, he's a handyman.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
For the role of one of my most searing childhood crushes, love a gimlet-eyed brunette, Marion Ravenwood. So named, Marion Ravenwood is funny. She's named after Lawrence Kasdan's wife's grandmother and Ravenwood Drive or Court or something in L.A. that he would take every day to get to work. Karen Allen nabbed the role after Spielberg's then-girlfriend Amy Irving couldn't do it. And Allen recalled that Barbara Hershey, Deborah Winger, Sean Young were all floated as well, which is funny because Sean Young would then go on to be in Blade Runner opposite Harrison Ford. But Spielberg said that he had his eye on Allen ever since Animal House. She met with him and then flew to LA to screen test against the other actors being considered as Indy. She screen tested with John Shea, she's talked about, and Tim Matheson.
Who's also Otter in Animal House, along with Karen Allen.
She told The Hollywood Reporter in 2021, "I don't remember how long it was, but I got a call that they were offering me the film. They wanted me to read the script and give them an answer within 2 days. They had a courier bring the script, and he had to sit in my room the whole time while at the hotel. Then I had to give it back to him." This project was shrouded under a great deal of secrecy. They were apparently very hush-hush about the whole thing, which is understandable given the names that were involved, but it's just still funny that this swing and home run swing of a movie pitch, they were treating it like it was, in fact, the Grail. Even though she was still fairly young and unknown, Allen was actually able to lobby for changes to the character. There's that scene where she and Belloc, I think his name is.
I think so, yeah.
I'm never sure if it's pronounced because he's supposed to be French, so it's supposed to be like it should be like Belloc, but they all just call him Belloc. Anyway,
Because we're American, damn it.
yeah, they improvised that scene apparently because they thought it would be funnier to have them be like drinking and kind of have that loosey goosey feel to it. So that scene is like largely improvised, but she made it mandated that apparently their dynamic was supposed to be that she actually like had feelings for Belloc, even though he's the villain, and that was like a thread that she wanted removed from her character's arc because she wanted her to always be, Indy's gal. So when she like faux seduces him and has the knife under her dress, that was her addition that she pushed for. And because she said she wanted to give the character a kind of integrity and a real sense of loyalty and love to Indiana Jones. And Marion's feistiness, shall we say, was there from the beginning. The first time Spielberg met Karen Allen, he asked her, "How well do you spit?" Which, phrasing. Especially in 70s Hollywood.
Oh, well, despite their chemistry on screen, Karen Allen, who is a classically trained theater actor, wasn't used to Harrison Ford's method of working, which was very, very private. She told The Hollywood Reporter, "The thing that was challenging for me at the time was Harrison very much worked privately. He liked to work on his lines and a scene by himself in his trailer. He didn't much like to run lines with other actors. In the beginning, I didn't know how to take it. I didn't know whether to take it personally. Coming out of the theater, I was so used to working with other actors and running lines, so it took me a while to make an adjustment to that. But then we got into a groove with each other." And in their first scene, when Karen Allen cold cocks Indy, Karen actually hit Harrison Ford in the face for real. She said he was slightly annoyed. She's talking to Uprocks in 2021. But I mean, it happens. I had never punched anyone in a film before. So they were showing me how to do it, and I was doing my absolute best. And as far as I was concerned, his chin just got in the way of my hand. Which is funny because didn't Harrison Ford sock Ryan Gosling?
He sure did. Blade Runner 2049.
Blade Runner, yeah.
Yeah, and you can see the actual frame. So people have identified the exact moment in the film where Ryan Gosling got punched in the jaw, and it sure looks like he did.
Well, yeah, the look on his face is like, oh my God, I just got punched by Harrison Ford, and I'm not even that mad about it. And Harrison Ford looks like the same look of horror that I imagine would be on his face when he pulled down the wrong runway in his plane. And it's cute.
Oh, man.
Less cute. Sexism. Much has been made of the age gap between Marion and Indy. Karen Allen said that she envisioned the character was 16 and Indiana was 26 when they had their initial relationship, which, not great. In that Uprocks interview that I mentioned earlier, Karen Allen says that what actually happened between the pair is ambiguous. She said they could have kissed a few times, and she was just completely bowled over, and he could have just not wanted to get involved with someone so young. I don't think of him as a pedophile. Which is good.
Good, yeah. What's much worse is that I believe it was Lucas who was like, Marion's 11.
No.
And Spielberg was like, no, George, Jesus Christ. The more you read about George Lucas, the more you're like, at least I am somewhat of the opinion that he was a very lucky man because some of his ideas are awful and frequently mitigated by his collaborators.
I'm thinking about the Mackenzie Phillips character in American Graffiti who was like 14 and driving around with the 20-year-old.
Yeah, it gets grosser because I'm pretty sure in Temple of Doom, like, so nobody wanted to make Temple of Doom, apparently. Like, they were all just like, even though this was like a 3-picture deal, they just had no, like, they were all checked out at that point in their careers or whatever. We're like, we don't want to do this. And George was the one pushing for it because he had read about the Thuggee cult in India, which is the central crux of that movie, even though it is hilariously offensive, and so offensive, in fact, that India would not let them film there when they learned what the film was about. And it's filmed in Malaysia, I think. Anyway, and so Kate Capshaw is like Indy's, nominal love interest co-lead. And before they landed on her, George Lucas wanted to make it like a princess character, like a virginal princess character that Indy had to like rescue. And it was just like, what is this fixation you have with young women, my dude? Because I'm pretty sure Princess Leia was also supposed to be like 15 or 16 in his original docs. So Yeah.
I mean, you watch all those speeches and American Film Institute, like award ceremonies where Carrie Fisher would like honor/roast him.
Yeah.
And the venom is very real. Like,
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, the famous thing that she kept being like, I have to do all this running and like my costume doesn't have a bra. Like, what are you doing, George? He's like, they don't have bras in space. There's no gravity.
no underwear in space. Yeah. Yeah. But for all of Karen Allen's many talents, she wasn't quite as intense as Harrison Ford was when it came to stunts. But
she was surrounded by actual fire during that bar scene in her bar in Nepal. That there were no doubles used in that scene for her or Ford, and she said that much of the fire in that was real. And then there's the Well of Souls scene. For those of you who don't have the entire command of the film at your fingertips, the Well of Souls is the snake-filled pit, where you get the classic line, snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? Because Indy hates snakes. So they descend into a snake-filled pit. That took 8 days straight to film at Elstree Studios. Famously, they had something like 2,500 snakes, and Steven Spielberg was like, we need more snakes. So they flew in a bunch of snakes from all over Europe, including Denmark, and ended up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 snakes, is what I've read, which is too many to be around. Period. Karen Allen remembered to The Hollywood Reporter, the cobras were handled in a very special way, and there was an ambulance just outside the set, and a nurse who had anti-venom. Often there was plexiglass between us and them. Still, there were a few people on the set who were bitten by the pythons, which aren't poisonous, but it is a nasty bite. No one was in terrible danger with them, unless you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think it was our first assistant director who was trying to protect someone else who got bitten one. So for that sequence, snake handler Stephen Edge ended up shaving his legs and putting on a dress to serve as a double for Marion's character because neither Karen Allen nor her stunt double wanted to take that plunge.
Is that a verse from Lou Reed's Walk on the Wild Side?
Shaved the legs and then stood in the snakes. He said, hey, babe. There's a bit in here about the anti-venom I didn't put in that I wanted to...
Oh, please.
They did use a lot of rubber snakes, but, you know.
But why? There's 7,000 real snakes.
Harris and I were just kind of having snakes dumped on us because the minute they hit the ground, they were trying to go away into cool, dark places. And instead of being in the light, Karen Allen told the Los Angeles Daily News in 2021, and they dumped snakes on us. And then Steven would scream, action. Don't worry, though, because the snake that Spielberg dumped on her was dead. Allen explained. It was a dead python, which Steven had left on ice for 3 days until it was completely decayed. Apparently, she wasn't screaming convincingly enough, was what I heard Spielberg say, so that he had to, yeah.
It's very Kubrickian, who also filmed at Elstree a lot.
And speaking of...
Yes, that's right. Wow.
Segue.
I did not even mean to make that segue. John Baxter, in his book Steven Spielberg, an unauthorized biography, claims that production of Raiders of the Lost Ark was delayed for a day when Stanley Kubrick's daughter Vivian showed up to visit the set and was horrified by the treatment of the snakes. And she called the British version of the ASPCA on the production, who shut things down while Spielberg made the mandated charges. Fortunately, Vivian apparently didn't know about the deaf rat. Heigl, tell us about the deaf rat.
So they had a bunch of rats brought in. And do you know, actually, in Last Crusade, they had to breed all of those rats because they couldn't use native rats because they would have been riddled with disease in Venice. So for that scene, those are all special. They were specially bred for the film. Fun fact. But it's like a blink and you'll miss it shot. It's when the Ark is being transported, right? And they're down in the ship's hold, and it's like thrumming with hoo-ha power or whatever. And one of the rats is like doing like weird head stuff, and they're like, "Oh, that's the power that the Ark has." Not so. Kathleen Kennedy, legendary producer Kathleen Kennedy, says that it was their animal wrangler. They were like, why is that rat doing that? And he was like, I've had it since it was a baby. I can't bear to get rid of it. It's deaf. So it's like not useful as like a trained rat, but it's like my pet deaf rat. And they were like, great, he's a star. which feels like another labor violation.
Cigar chopping. Get me that rat.
Get me the deaf rat.
Mickey's on his way out.
The cigar falls out of his mouth in the screening room. He's like, that rat's a star.
It's like an All About Eve, but it's just about Mickey Mouse and the deaf rat.
Oh yeah, okay. So I found the serum thing. They tried, because they had this cobra, and they had to. The snake wrangler said you had to intentionally piss them off to get their hood to come out, right? Because that's the iconic cobra thing. So they're intentionally like patting them on the head. It's the same thing you see snake charmers doing. They just like boop them on the head so that they flare up. But they
little bunny foo-foo.
Yeah,
there.
exactly. But they needed anti-venom around the serum. What producer Frank Marshall called the Serum Man. He was the only guy in the country who had it. They went to a local hospital to try to get some, but theirs was expired. And finally, the anti-venom arrived after being airlifted by the American Embassy, the Air Force Hospital, and the Naval Hospital. That was how they ended up getting it on set, was like this diplomatic trifecta of organizations.
I mean, I kind of would wish that most hospitals, if not all, had a little bit of anti-venom in.
Yeah, but no, this was expired. Apparently, the cobra killed a python.
6,999 more.
Yeah, right. Oh, man. Anyway, for Indy's sidekick partner, Salah, they're digging in the wrong place. They're digging in the wrong... I just remember him singing that. What a great voice that guy has. Jonathan Rhys Davies. That role was initially supposed to go to Danny DeVito.
That's insane.
They're digging in the wrong place, Indy. He couldn't do it because of Taxi. Jonathan Rhys Davies had been in a movie called Shogun that Steven Spielberg had seen. And when they talked over the part, Rhys Davies, who is 6'1", told Empire Magazine, I went to see him and said, well, look, it says here that Salah is a 5'2" skinny Egyptian Bedouin. Are you proposing surgery? He said, no, we'll just, make him a big guy. He also told to Empire, I remember meeting one of the snake wranglers who had caught a crew member with this large snake. The guy said, I just want to take it home for my kid. It'll only die anyway. The snake wrangler stuck it in the glove compartment of his car and forgot all about it. By the time he remembered, the snake had gone. Later, he was taking his wife and mother-in-law for a drive. And of course, the snake reappeared.
Oh, God.
Classic bit. Mother-in-law, snake in the car, works every time. Paul Freeman, who played the slimy archaeologist Belloc, was pitched as the champagne adversary to Indy's beer. Among the candidate role was the Italian actor Giancarlo Giannini, and he almost signed for the part, but Spielberg saw Freeman in a BBC film called Death of a Princess. I guess this is just hilarious to me that Steven Spielberg just watches all these movies and is like, I want that guy. Because it seems like he's just his own casting director, which is based on the movies that he watches, which is great.
Yeah.
He cast him the day that he met the day that he met Paul Freeman. And Paul Freeman talks about this. He went in and just saw Steven Spielberg and George Lucas on the floor with a Walkman, like just toying around with a Walkman. And they were like, oh yeah, check this out, man. Hit it off. He was like, great, you're in the movie now. The most famous contribution that Paul Freeman makes to this role is the scene in the canyon where Indy has the rocket launcher aimed at the Ark. And he's like, I'm going to blow it up. I'm gonna blow it up. And he's like, you won't do it, Dr. Jones.
That's good.
Great movie.
That's good. Good.
Thanks.
Good impressions on both.
Dr. Jones. No, that's a little too British. I guess that guy's British, but he's supposed to be playing French. His accent is just kind of broadly
transatlantic.
Broadly European. So there's a scene where a fly lands on his face, and it seems to go into his mouth, and it's become such a thing that Pauline Kael wrote about it in her review for the film and got what Paul Freeman calls his favorite review of his acting career, where she cited his extraordinary devotion to his craft. However, he didn't actually eat the fly. In post-production, the editors removed a few frames in between the fly strolling down his face and when it flew off to make it look like he had eaten it. And then the sound team also added extra buzzing into the mix to call attention to it. Fun fact, that is the exact same canyon in Tunisia where the Jawas take R2-D2 in the first Star Wars movie. And they pop up and like, in Indy, and R2 gets shocked by the thing. He's wow, you know that scene. There's a bunch of Easter eggs going back and forth between these two movies. You can pause, freeze frame, and see C-3PO and R2-D2 are carved as hieroglyphics in the Well of Souls.
No way.
Yeah, it's a famous one, I think. And then the plane that he takes off in, that at the beginning of the film has the its call sign is OB for Obi-Wan and 3PO. So that's cute. Freeman's favorite memory of filming was finding a lot of extremely cheap champagne in the hotel in Tunisia. The labels had washed off in a flood, but that was rather frivolous. Just love that. Much of the rest of the cast was rounded out by Brits. We have Denham Elliott playing Marcus Brody. I couldn't find anything about Denham Elliott being in this movie. He like, as much as I love him,
so
in this
much.
And Last Crusade, I couldn't find a single interview where he talked about making this movie. But there's a lot of other, British dudes in here. The creepy giggling Nazi interrogator who gets the thing burned into his hand was originally offered to Klaus friggin' Kinski, which would have been horrifying because Klaus Kinski is a legitimately insane man. But he instead chose to appear in the horror film Venom because the money was better. So Spielberg picked this guy, Ronald Lacey, because he reminded him of Peter Lorre. And in the one creative decision I don't agree that Steven Spielberg made for this, when George Lucas originally pitched this character, he was going to have an antenna sticking out of his head and a robotic arm like Dr. Strangelove that he would shoot people with, and the gun barrel was going to be his index finger, and that rules.
Yeah.
And Spielberg was like, "Come on, George, dial it back." And it maybe also for budgetary reason, probably. British wrestler Pat Roach is killed twice in the film. He's a giant Sherpa in the Nepalese bar, and then he is the German mechanic who gets pureed by the Flying Wings propeller. No?
No.
You didn't like that?
I just, he didn't hear me. I was silent laughing on the floor.
Okay.
Well, with the strict budget considerations in place, Spielberg hired 4 illustrators and gave each of them parts of the script, and he managed to storyboard about 80% of the film, or nearly 6,000 images. And Spielberg kept to about 60% of that, but he also had the art department build scale models for each set, which helped him pre-plan all the angles and shots for each scene. Principal photography for Raiders began in June 1980 on, again, a $20 million budget. It concluded that September, just 73 days of filming, which, considering how elaborate this was, is pretty spry.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
Especially with all the location stuff they had to do. Like, just imagine you lose a week in somewhere, and that throws your entire thing off budget, and then you get financially reamed in the ass by Paramount. Like, I can't believe they pulled it off.
Filming took place on sets at Elstree Studios in England, as well as on location at La Rochelle, France, Tunisia, and Hawaii. Spielberg wrote in American Cinematographer, "We had almost $4 million in sets alone. And when you multiply that against $100,000 per day shooting on distant location and everybody's salaries and what it costs today to shoot a movie internationally, you see why it made the film cost $20 million. He also said that they couldn't even afford to use specific cameras like a
Luma crane?
Luma crane. I don't know what that is, but I imagine it's very expensive.
I think it's the crane rig they use to move cameras around. It's what they use in the Nepal bar scene. Or a Panaglide. They also couldn't afford that for the entire thing. They had to literally...
What is that, like Steadicam?
Yeah. It's the non-Steadicam one, but it is the same effect. As I mentioned earlier, the first location that they... Why did I say that? Did I mention that earlier? The first location they shot at was in La Rochelle, France, 100 miles north of Bordeaux, for the sub scene. Things got off to a rough start. For the first 2 days, the weather kept them from filming anything. So, again, that sucks when you have 73 days to film. But before they could even shoot a single frame, production faced a headache in securing a boat that could serve as the 1930s era tramp steamer called the Bantu Wind, which is what Indy and Marion take to London. There was a replica in Berlin, but it couldn't be taken out to sea, so they found an Egyptian boat in Ireland, fitted it according to production needs, and then just sailed it to France, which I love. Love boat stuff. Jordan, speaking of boat stuff, let's move on to Jordan's boat corner.
My favorite. I love large boat trivia. The sub that Indiana Jones boards, and we'll use that term loosely in this movie, is the very same one that appears in Wolfgang Petersen's Das Boot. Both films were in production around the same time, and Spielberg opted to work out a deal to rent their sub rather than building one from scratch. But the contract with the German owners of this sub had the production specify that it couldn't go out to sea under certain conditions, and an engineer from Munich who'd helped build this sub was attached to the production to act as its handler, sub-handler. Imagine that being your IMDb page. But that is a real German U-boat pen, which is where they would dock U-boats, and incidentally, it was actually covered in Nazi graffiti and carvings with a lot of bomb scarring and damage. And this is why Wolfgang Petersen and Steven Spielberg became close, and why Spielberg did a lot of uncredited help on Wolfgang Petersen's child traumatizing classic, The Never-Ending Story, a few years later in the 80s.
Another apocryphal bit from that is that apparently the Das Boot production didn't know that their sub had been rented out, so they all showed up to work one day and they were like, "Where's the sub?" And they're like, "Steven Spielberg's using it in France." Just, I guess, take the day off, go get some schnitzel. After France, production began shooting interiors on location in England. You mentioned earlier Elstree, a very famous studio, is where a lot of the interiors were done. But the Rickmansworth Masonic School in England stood in for the interiors of Indy's fictitious Marshall College. The exteriors of that are actually in Stockton, California, at the University of the Pacific. One of the only other U.S. locations that they filmed in was in Kauai, in Hawaii, which is a beautiful island, where they also did Jurassic Park, apparently a big fave of Spielberg and Lucas. And one of the other scant U.S. locations is San Francisco City Hall. At the end of the movie, after they get debriefed by the U.S. governments, that's not in D.C. That's the interior of San Francisco City Hall when Indy and Marion walk off arm in arm. The opening temple scene is also noteworthy, not just because of the boulder chase, which we already covered, but it's Alfred Molina's first ever on-screen role. And for the scene when Molina turns around, he's covered in tarantulas, Spielberg was annoyed because the spiders were being too sluggish for his tastes. And the animal wrangler said, well, they're all men. They're all males, so they don't have any impetus to behave aggressively because there's not a female in there. So Spielberg was like, well, then put a female in there. And of course, they all started running all over Alfred Molina. And another fun Star Wars connection, there's a long, woody species of vine called Old Man's Beard that they used to dress the outside of the temple, which is the same they used for the Dagobah set in The Empire Strikes Back.
Are you a big Star Wars guy?
I was. It's one of the biggest disappointments of my adult pop culture life, you know.
The prequels and beyond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that because that didn't happen with Indiana Jones until I was already pretty dead inside.
Yeah.
Like 21 or whatever. So it didn't hit as hard. But man, the first Star Wars movies that I remembered coming out in theaters were like, even as a kid, I was like, as a 12-year-old, I was like, these are not good. Anyway, but far and away the biggest hurdle production faced was Tunisia. Specifically, the 70 acres in the desert of Sadala, where it was 130 degrees. And then sometimes a breeze would come along and drop it down to around 115. They had hired 600 Tunisian extras for the dig scene, and Spielberg was working at a frantic pace to keep the film on schedule, averaging 35 shot setups a day. That is bananas. He's called Raiders the film that I learned how to compromise on. Describing each scene averaging 3 to 5 takes instead of something like 17, which is partially why the film feels so quick and kind of and loosey-goosey. Paul Freeman, who played Belloc, told Total Film, "I've never seen a crew worked so flat out. You'd see them asleep with their faces in their lunch." Complicating matters was the fact that an enormous percentage of the cast and crew got sick. Jonathan Rhys-Davies supposedly shit himself in costume at one point while bending over. And of course, the film's biggest laugh line comes out of Ford's own battle with his guts. Originally, the scene with the swordsman that he, spoilers, there's a scene with this guy who has this big scimitar and he's like waving the sword around and you think it's going to be this big fight scene and he just shoots him. Tremendous. That originally took up like 2 pages in the script and it was supposed to be this big showstopper for how Indy uses his whip. They like pitched it. They were like, okay, it's going to be this big badass thing where one guy has a sword, Indy has his whip, and blah, 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 blah. And then, but Harrison Ford had dysentery. And even worse, Karen Allen told Total Film, the swordsman was kind of inept. He had not really learned these choreographed moves, and it was looking like it wasn't going to come off. So Harrison Ford told Entertainment Tonight, I wasn't able to stay away from my trailer for more than the length to shoot a magazine, which is the load of film stock that a camera has on average about 10 minutes. I thought about it. We had about an hour and a half ride into our location. By the time I got to the location, I was convinced it was too much. I went up to Steven as soon as I arrived and I said, Steven, why don't we just shoot this sumbitch? And Steven said, I was thinking that too. And movie magic was born.
Yes. Things got so bad on location that they literally ran out of extras, and Spielberg conscripted producer Frank Marshall to act as the pilot of the flying wing during the runway fight. And Marshall told Empire, Steven said, go and put that outfit on and you can be the pilot. I said, how long is this going to be, Steven? I'm also the producer. He said, oh, just a morning. It was about 150 degrees Fahrenheit in that cockpit, and you have Karen Allen hitting me over the head with the chalks. That wasn't much of a stunt. It just hurt. It took 3 days, by the way. And that flying wing was designed by artist Ron Cobb, and that actually more closely resembles the look of a U.S. prototype developed in the 1940s. And the version of the film was built by Vickers Aircraft Company in England and painted at Elstree Studios and then disassembled, shipped and rebuilt on location, and then abandoned and then subsequently disassembled again over the years by souvenir hunters, which I find cool. I wish I had a piece of that.
They used to do that when they were shooting in Tunisia.
Yeah, they left the sets for like Tatooine, right?
Yeah, they said yeah, it's just like it was just out there. Apparently, I can't remember where I was reading this now, but I think this was like sort of a Wild West era for shooting in that part of the world. And then they sort of wised up and made it harder for people to shoot there or more expensive or whatever. So yeah, they would just build these sets and then just be like, yeah, we're done with it. Bye. Just imagine coming across a replica of a World War II era bomber with your camel or whatever. Is that racist?
I mean, I just can't believe all the, Luke Skywalker's home and stuff was just left out there. I mean, you know what I have to say about that? Belongs in a museum. Well, of the two brains behind Raiders, Steven Spielberg fared a little bit better in Tunisia. He remembered George Lucas's horror stories from shooting Star Wars there, so he arrived armed with cases of bottled water and canned SpaghettiOs, which he stored in his hotel room, and he ate cold 3 times a day. And also, my favorite, he also gaffer taped his mouth shut while he showered to prevent waterborne illnesses. George Lucas, meanwhile, who, again, should have known better considering he had dealt with all of the unique horrors of shooting in Tunisia. He had already been sent home from France with severe seasickness. So when he arrived in Tunisia to help to shoot the second unit footage, he was just absolutely hammered health-wise. He got badly sunburned to the point where his head and face swelled up, and he suffered permanent redness for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that because he always looks like ruddy and uncomfortable. And apparently it's because he got like severe sun poisoning in this. Yeah, Steven Spielberg like sent him out with a camera. He was like, yeah, you can shoot some second unit stuff for me. And George Lucas came back and was like,
we'll put it right here on the fridge so everyone can see it.
George Lucas came back like, Steven, I'm very sunburned. He's like, Jesus Christ, I can't trust you for one damn thing. The film's Cairo, that stands in for the city of Cairo, is the holy city of Kairouan in northern Tunisia, the 4th holiest city in Islam. I don't know how they grade such things, but didn't make the top 3. It is home to the great mosque of Sidi Uqba. There's another great animal story from the film. The Nazi monkey spy. Can't believe we made it this far to bad dates.
Yeah.
The Nazi monkey spy. Producer Frank Marshall told Empire, that was quite a day when Steven said, get the monkey to salute. An amazing sentence, one I was privileged to read. I said to the animal handler, this is Frank Marshall again. I said to the animal handler, show me the monkey saluting. He went over, took a stick, and tapped the monkey on the head. The monkey sort of protected himself with his arm, and that was supposed to be saluting. So we devised a process. Put a grape on a fishing pole, hold the grape just out of his reach, and he would reach. After about 50 takes, finally looked like he was doing his Heil Hitler. 5 takes for dialogue, 50 takes to get a monkey to do the Nazi salute. That's why he's the greatest of all time. From Tunisia, production trekked to Kauai in Hawaii, Awikawawa, for the opening scene of the film. To get the requisite misty mountain atmosphere, they brought smoke machines and were just running across these open meadows to properly fog up the terrain and stay just ahead of the wind to get the shots. And even though it looks like they're just like, they took like a short hike to get to this temple, that was like 10 acres of the island that they trekked across for all these different setups. Because Steven Spielberg is an obsessive and wanted very particular parts of the jungle to serve his vision. If you're ever on Kauai, the mountain that the Paramount logo dissolves into in that opening shot is Kalalea Mountain, which is nicknamed King Kong. I had heard that was a tribute to one of the first things that Steven ever did with the camera was like learn how to do like a matte shot dissolve when he was making his little Super 8 films. Sadly, they were beset by mosquitoes outside of for the exterior of the temple that they picked. Despite being slathered with the stuff, they were all bitten to shreds, and they ran into further problems with the donkeys that they had hired. Namely, the donkeys crapped out, and replacements had to be sourced. But the pickup donkeys were the wrong color, and so had to be dutifully painted brown with hair color spray. And then, one of the last shots in the film was on the coast of Nepali, and that is only reachable by helicopter. So they brought a crate, blindfolded the donkeys, and airlifted them one at a time onto location. Tremendous stuff.
The blindfolding really does it for me.
Well, you can't have a panicked donkey, man. That's just a recipe for bad luck. Jordan, why don't you tell us a little bit about that plane? Because I know you love, aside from boats, you love planes.
I just love Air Force One because of Harrison Ford.
Read the damn graph, Jordan.
The plane Indiana uses to escape was a 1930s Waco biplane located in Junction City, Oregon. Owned by Henry and Alice Strach, the plane was redressed with little nods to Star Wars, which I think you mentioned earlier. Its identification numbers
yeah, I did. Sorry. Yeah.
are OB and 3PO, and it was flown by a real-life pilot named Fred Sorensen, who was originally hired by Spielberg and producer Frank Marshall to fly them around while location scouting in Hawaii. They actually crashed it once. You write minorly.
It was like 20 feet, apparently. It was enough that they just did it again. Like it didn't mess them up to the point where, Harrison Ford does not care about his own life. So he was just like, get me back on the plane.
I guess I did it one more time, and that is the shot that appears in the film. And over a decade later, Sorensen wound up in their orbit again. He was working for Hawaiian Airlines when he and his crew volunteered for the Salvation Army to bring blankets and water across Kauai after a Category 3 hurricane hit the island. And while there, he ran into producer Kathleen Kennedy, who's Spielberg's, right hand, basically, who enlisted him to help fly the Jurassic Park crew off the island. So that's cool.
I just love that so much. He came back 10 years later and rescued all of them again. Oh, so good. As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages. The film's central MacGuffin, the Ark of the Covenant, is sort of a real thing? ? According to the Bible, the Ark was a wooden chest covered with gold, carrying a stone tablet of the Ten Commandments, as well as the walking stick that Moses' brother Aaron carried. In the Old Testament, it's written that the Ark helped move obstacles and poisonous animals out of the Israelites' path, even stopping the flow of obstructing rivers. When the Babylonian Empire conquered the Israelites in 597 BC, the Ark seemingly vanished. One of the most consistent claims is that it is currently in Ethiopia, in the St. Mary of Zion Cathedral of Aksum, in the north of the country. Although, hilariously, much like the Mormon tablets, only one man is allowed inside to see it. So its authenticity has never been verified. Oh yeah, we have the Ark. May I see it? No. Raiders took the design from the Ark by paintings by a guy named James Tissot, who is he did a bunch of Life of Christ and biblical paintings. He was a 19th century painter. But that image of it where it appears in the Bible when they're doing the exposition dump about what the Ark actually is, that was designed by Ralph McQuarrie, who is one of these concept artists with his fingerprints all over, the latter back half of 20th century cinema. He is the one who did the concept art for Star Wars that initially helped George Lucas sell the idea to 20th Century Fox. He did designs for Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T., both of the original Star Wars sequels, and he went on to win an Academy Award for Cocoon. So he had a series of rough sketches, and he created the illustration that's in that book of the Ark destroying an army. And he said they needed an antique-looking image to match the look of an old Bible they had, showing the powers of the Ark of the Covenant. I did a couple sketches for the design until I arrived at one that looked best on the page. I took photos of some of the guys at ILM to use as a photo reference. I etched a plate and printed it on rice paper to match the paper in the Bible. I mounted the print I made in the Bible, which was colored and washed by someone else. So that's insane to me. This guy created his own etching and printing plate and then printed it himself on rice paper. Nowadays, Photoshop. Incredible.
And they didn't have Steadicam, but they went for that.
Hell yeah.
Fun fact, while the original screen used Ark prop is on display or being held at gunpoint or whatever at Skywalker Ranch in Marin County, a prototype created by a prop man showed up on Antiques Roadshow on 2020 after being discovered by the man's son. They used it to keep blankets in their San Francisco apartment when he was a kid. I love that. It was pretty junky. Yeah.
I was gonna say it was kind of chintzy.
It was like made from like a hot glue gun, and all the statues on it were like trophy toppers and stuff. And I think they used like photo frame edges and stuff. It was very much a proof of concept, but it was valued at $120,000.
Hell yeah.
It belongs in a museum. As for the horrifying powers of the Ark, production didn't really have a lot to go on in terms of ideas. In the script, the line was, they opened the Ark and all hell breaks loose. As a screenwriting major, I can say that's lazy.
I just love how lazy that all their concepts were, where it was like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were like, yeah, he's going to be on a truck, he's going to chase the thing. And that they just handed it to Lawrence Kasdan and we're like, now you do the rest.
So he meets some cool people. They beat him up. He beats them up. That's act 2. Just fill it in.
Isn't that how it works?
I mean, sadly, yes. Can confirm. But during pre-production, a series of storyboard artists named Ed Verreau, Dave Negron, Michael Lloyd, and Joe Johnson each did a preliminary concept that ranged from ghosts to a firestorm to strange lights. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg liked them all and tasked Joe Johnson with combining all three. Richard Enlund and his team at Industrial Light and Magic were responsible for pulling off this effect, which was a royal pain because not only was Raiders very strictly budgeted, but ILM was also working on post-production for the film Dragon Slayer at the time. They eventually went with the old cloud tank used in Close Encounters, which they combined with puppetry and other optical compositing techniques. Heigl, tell us about cloud tanks. I know very little about cloud tanks.
This is so cool. I love all this like in-camera stuff. I mean, it's not in-camera, but it's close to in-camera. Cloud tanks were developed by this SFX artist, Doug Trumbull, for Close Encounters. And then you see him again in Flash Gordon, which is hilarious. It's really interesting. It's like simultaneously high and low tech. Basically, it is a tank in which different temperatures and densities of water, so you have different salinity levels of salt water to make it basically make them float on top of each other. It's the same principle as layered shots at a bar. So they create these different layers in the tank, and then they use a remote control arm to squirt dyes and pigments into the tank at various intersections of these layers of water. And that's how you get this crazy, like swirling, but still very distinct colors that happens. And then they basically just put this thing in front of a camera and film it like a matte painting almost. And boy, we'll get to the matte painting later. So one of the non-puppets in that scene is actually the lady who floats up in front of the screen and then all of a sudden turns into a horrifying ghoul. She was a receptionist from ILM. They were just like, you're a ghost. Come here.
Take the phone off the hook.
Yeah. They just put her long white robes, painted her face, and then had her sit on a trapeze, like swinging seat in front of a blue screen. And they had her swing away from the camera and then reverse that footage for the film so that her clothes and everything are all moving all ghostly like. And then the sounds of the Ark are sea lion and dolphin cries through a vocoder, which sounds like your average experimental show in Brooklyn.
Prince's less successful follow-up to When Doves Cry.
And the sound of the Ark being lifted off is Ben Burt's toilet tank at home.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So for the Nazis' grisly deaths, Spielberg, who is Jewish, envisioned that each of them would die horribly in different separate ways. So to achieve that end, they took molds of each actor, and then the makeup artist on this is a guy named Chris Walas, who would go on to achieve his own masterpiece a few years later with The Fly, when he turns Jeff Goldblum into a series of ever more disgusting titular insect men. So he made a series of artificial heads from these molds. The guy playing the Colonel was rigged with these air bladders that, usually when you see like air bladder technology in films, it's for like a werewolf transformation. And that's how you get, you fill, you put latex over it and then you pump air into it and it creates the impression that the flesh is like swelling. That's like one of the big American Werewolf in London transformation scene moves. But what they did in Raiders is they filled this head with the bladders and then that were already inflated. And then when it came time for his head to kind of shrink down and mummify, they just sucked all of the air out of it with a vacuum, which collapsed the thing.
That's cool.
It took 8 or 9 people to control that mechanism. Just manipulating the different bladders and stuff that were inside the head. The interrogator, Tot, who his face melts. It's the coolest thing in the world. His model head was made of a multi-layered gelatin compound, specifically alginate, the same stuff that your dentist uses, and filled with yarn, also to mimic sinews and tendon. And they built it on a base of stone skull, because they couldn't use anything that was more fragile, because the way that they achieved the face melting was to actually melt the face. They just propped it and put 2 propane heaters on either side of it, and Chris Walas stood under it with a hairdryer, and they just melted the thing down, and it just got all goopy and gross as it dissolved, and they just ran that in fast. It was shot at less than a frame a second. So it's time lapse. And then for Belloc, they used a plaster skull with a bunch of latex and gel over it, and then they just blew it up. They literally destroyed it with not just an air cannon, not just miniature explosive charges like the kind you'd see for squibs or whatever, but shotguns. They literally...
That seems like overkill.
Yes, it is. And I'll tell you why they did that. Because Chris Walas, who worked on The Fly, that movie is directed by David Cronenberg. Walas had previously worked with David Cronenberg on Scanners, which features probably the most famous head explosion in all of cinema. And to achieve that, they simply cleared the set and fired a shotgun at this model. So when Spielberg was like, I want to make this head explode, a little light bulb goes off over Chris Walas's head. He's like, I got just the thing. And it's disgusting. They used 4 or 5 pieces of primer cord to sever the neck, 3 different detonators under the eyes and chin, again, in addition to an air cannon and shotguns. The head was filled with blood bags that they stuffed with just gross crap they had lying around, like dried latex and foam scraps, but also, disgustingly, bits of real actual meat. And worst of all, this had to be done 3 times to get the shot. So they were just... What a hoot and holler, man. Just firing a couple of shotguns at a head filled with old meat. That's the title of my memoir. And it was so disgusting that because there was no PG-13 at the time, this would have gotten them an R rating, so that they had to optically print the shitty flame effects over it to distract from how disgusting it was. Another fun fact for you, Jaws and Temple of Doom specifically are 2 films that helped create the PG-13 rating.
I was just going to ask you.
Same with Gremlins, I think. I think it's like kind of all right in this era where there's all this stuff coming out that should not have been shown to children, but was still getting PG ratings because they were like, well, it's not R rating. So thus PG-13 was created. So, probably the most famous matte painting of all time. In the end, the top men are taking care of it. And then you pan to the warehouse, and the Ark is being wheeled into that warehouse, the government warehouse. It's just filled with thousands upon thousands of nondescript wooden crates containing all the wonders of the world. So they also used a matte painting for when the Nazis fall off the cliff. There's like 3 of them in the movie. But the warehouse matte painting was by a guy named Michael Pangrazio. It took him 3 months to paint that onto a sheet of glass. And then what they do is just position that in front of the camera. The only thing in that, are you looking at it?
Yeah.
The only thing in that scene that isn't a painting is the guy walking down the path. Like if you look at this matte painting and without the being composited in, it's literally like 95% of the frame. All of that was actually filmed in there is just the dude pushing the cart down the path. It's incredible. It's one of the coolest pieces of movie magic. Whiz bang. Pangrazio did this off of a single reference image of some boxes that he took. And he worked for ILM and Lucasfilm. He went on to form his own company and won 6 Oscars for visual effects. So, hell of a career. You're just looking at this thing agog.
It's
the proper
incredible
reaction, which is what I love.
There's a great composite photo of the scene completed and just the matte painting. And yeah, it's just like this tiny little bit of the path that the guy's walking down. And speaking of jaw-droppingly great elements of this movie, the score. Come on, one of the all-time great themes, courtesy of, who else? John Williams.
The other greatest of all time.
Yes. He told Empire Magazine that the score took him a few weeks. He said, I remember playing Steven a couple options on the piano. He loved them and simply said, why don't you do both? Which is the same thing he said about what happens when the Ark of Covenant stuff goes down. He really just is like, oh, just do everything.
Yeah.
So those 2 tunes became the main theme and bridge of what we call the Raiders March. The interesting thing about the Raiders March is that it's a very simple little tune, but I spent more time on those bits of musical grammar than anything else. The sequence of notes has to sound just right, so it seems inevitable, like it's always been with us. That's cool.
It's so good. It sounds like a non-shitty Sousa march or something.
Yeah. It is really crazy. I guess I'm just thinking of Jaws and the Indiana Jones theme. How few notes he needs to make something that is instantly recognizable and iconic. From the Jaws 2 notes, da 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 da. I mean, that's just a handful right there.
You know, he's like a pop songwriter disguised as a composer, man. He has just the best melodies and tucked away in like these big grand sweeping things. And that's why I really think he is the best ever and maybe will be. I mean, because you look at other guys like even the Newmans, like they have really good themes and a lot of my other favorite film composers have these really great orchestrations and stuff. But John Williams, man, he's like the Beatles. Like how many of those scores are just slam dunks and it's just part of our shared cultural grammar now. I mean, it's funny too because you think of guys like Hans Zimmer, who's like more of a soundscape artist and like palette artist than he is like, I don't know, the most famous Hans Zimmer thing is just you know, like that's not a hook. But John Williams just has this stuff pouring out of him, just like another one, just tossing off these things that just become part of our they sound like they've always been there, you know.
And
people have said that he is a borrower. You know, famously, the Imperial March is from Holst, the Planet Suite. And you know, people have talked a little bit about how some of his big sweeping things, like the Superman theme and some of the Star Wars stuff, can be a little derivative and like universal generic, like they put it through the sweeping theme filter. But you know, those people, they haven't written this stuff. Like, holy God.
I ever tell you I met him?
No, was he chill?
Oh my God. Well, my mom went to, weird story, the premiere of Jurassic Park Lost World, and she met him there. And then she was flying back to Boston, where we're from, and John Williams obviously conducted the Boston Pops at the time, or I don't know if it was at the time, but he had a heavy Boston connection. They were sitting next to each other on the flight back, like the next day. So they apparently had a really nice time flying back, just chatting. And this was back when you could actually go meet people at the gate when they got off the plane, and they got off together. Mom was like, "Oh, Jordan, come here. I want you to meet this my new friend John." And he was really sweet, super sweet. Yeah, he was really nice to me. I would have been like, what, 9, 10. Yeah,
That's
he was really
awesome.
cool. Yeah, he was a nice guy. I think we like walked out like through security or whatever together, walked to like baggage claim or whatever with him and stuff too. And yeah, I remember even at the time being like, should she be leaving him alone now? But he was just like, seemed to be down the chat and stuff. Like it wasn't one of those like, okay, let me go now, I have places to go kind of things. We were just moseying on down there together. Yeah, he was cool.
I mean, he's the guy who like when a bunch of people that some kids just like found out where he lived and were playing like the Star Wars theme on his lawn rather than calling the police on him. He like came out and was like, sounds good, guys, like blah 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 blah, you know.
They played it like on instruments?
Yeah, it was like 2 trombone players.
Oh my god. Well, for Marion and Indy's themes, John Williams took inspiration from old Warner Brothers love stories like Now, Voyager, and what he called the kind of melodic sweep we would occasionally get from composers like Max Steiner. None of that means anything to me. He continued to Empire. I also remember doing pastiches of dark orchestral stabs that would represent the evil Nazis, as opposed to the good Nazis. The orchestra hits these 1940s dramatic chords, the 7th degree on the scale on the bottom, which is like an old signal of militaristic evil. We just did it for the camp fun of it. And it seems that's admissible in the style of a film like Raiders. For the opening of the Ark, I wanted to try to evoke a biblical atmosphere, turning pages backwards to early antiquity. The role of the orchestra and chorus is a complicated one in pieces like this. The music has to lure us in, so it seems like it's going to be a beautiful experience and then turn itself into something much more terrifying. I think he does that a lot in Last Crusade when they're in the room with all of the chalices in it. I feel like that's like a scene where it seems like he chooses poorly. And he chooses the wrong Holy Grail, and the music starts playing something beautiful, and you think it might actually be the one.
Yeah, like pull the rug out from under him.
Yeah, I love that. The music has to lure us in, so it seems like it's going to be a beautiful experience, and then turn itself around into something much more terrifying. That kind of sonic transformation often occurs in opera, and is one of the techniques a composer has at his disposal. I'm not a composer, so none of this means that much to me, but I find it really interesting, and I'm happy for him.
It's frustrating because I want to find out more about like the scoring and stuff, and it's frustrating to me when they speak about it in these very vague terms. But like, you know, having the 7th, what is that? A first inversion's 3rd in the bass, second inversion's 5th in the bass. So it's a 3rd inversion chord that he's talking about, having the lowered 7th in the bass.
That's cool.
That means something to me. Raiders opened at a time when the American film industry, hampered by the domestic recession, rising film production costs, and inflation of ticket prices, had been down for a year. But over 60 films were scheduled for release, with Richard Donner's Superman 2 expected to be the big hit of the season. The New York Times reported that with no brand awareness of the character, Paramount had provided theater owners with a more beneficial deal than usual to ensure that Raiders was screened in the best theaters and locations.
A press event was held for the film starring 2 camels, an elephant, and a python that cost $10,000. And prints were delivered to theaters with unusually stringent security measures, like lead-sealed containers and letters to theater managers holding them responsible for any misuse of the film in the US or Canada. That's weird. I mean, we were talking about earlier how they sent the script off to people and they have to like be in the room with a handler and then give it back to them and fly it back to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Guess that continued even after it was released, which it was on June 12th, 1981, earning $8.3 million in its opening weekend and going on to spend 40 weeks straight as one of the top 10 highest-grossing films in America. The film remained a steady success. It left theaters officially on March 18th, 1982, which is 9 months later. Although some theaters were still playing it as of that July 1982, which is over a year after it was released. Raiders earned an approximate total box office gross of $212.2 million, making it the highest grossing film of 1981, and in total it earned a worldwide gross of $354 million. It also scooped up 5 Academy Awards the following year for Best Art Direction, Best Film Editing, Best Sound Editing, and Best Visual Effects. The film also benefited from the burgeoning home media market of the time as well. In the early 1980s, the VCR home market was rapidly gaining popularity, and in November 1983, Paramount released a record 500,000 home video copies of Raiders, priced at a whopping $39.95. That's $120 in today's value. That's nuts.
Worth it.
Yeah, well, yeah. But I mean, how good were your home theaters in that era, too?
Yeah,
I
I
mean, seeing
don't
that
know.
on like a small, right? By 1985, over 1 million copies of the film had sold, making it the best-selling VHS of its time. While 6 years later, after the release of the third film in 1989, McDonald's launched possibly the largest video sales promotion to date, during which video cassettes of the first 3 Indiana Jones movies were sold at their restaurants for $5.99 each. What a deal. You have skipped the critical roundup of Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark because, to read this script, everyone loved this film.
They really did. I mean, like Canby, all these Ebert. I couldn't find. I mean, someone has surely said a bad word about it, but they were wrong. And then I just got distracted looking at pictures of Allison Duty in Last Crusade. What a pretty lady she was.
All I have to do is scream.
Yeah. Now on to the real question, though. How accurate is Raiders to the art of archaeology? To anyone with a brief working knowledge of the discipline, the answer is obviously not very. But much like Top Gun, there was a subsequent increase in students wanting to major in archaeology after the film's success. The University of California, Berkeley archaeologist Bill White told Smithsonian Magazine in 2021 that Indiana Jones made him want to become an archaeologist in the first place, saying, "These movies are an escape for many of us. I want non-archaeologists to know that's not really how archaeology is, but I don't want them to lose the value of these movies." So, probably the biggest thing from the get-go is that Indy destroys quite a lot of historical sites, which is a pretty big no-no, I'm told. Do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It is worth noting, though, in the second film that he does have a line that he understands, at least in this particular concept, the idea that certain artifacts should remain with the people in the societies that they actually belong to. He's returning the stone to the village, and then his awful love interest asks why he doesn't keep it. He says, "What for? They just put it in a museum and be another rock collecting dust." More interesting to me is that the field of archaeology has evolved today into a realm broadly described as cultural resource management. And this is according to the Smithsonian. Indy is ostensibly supported by his work at his college and by the British Museum, I think it is where Marcus Bertie is supposed to work. And that is accurate towards the time. But in the 1970s, there was legislation passed, particularly the Archaeological and Historical Preservation Act, that opened up essentially, in a lot of cases, a for-profit industry to get government grants and government money to, rather than go places and retrieve things or go on sort of unfettered wild goose chases, to find sites that are in danger of being eradicated and preserve them, learn as much as they can about them. Adrian Whitaker, an archaeologist with the CRM, Cultural Resource Management firm, Far Western Anthropological Research Group, which sounds threatening, told the Smithsonian Magazine that whereas Indiana Jones is basically a solo operator with a small supporting cast and adversarial relationship with local people, contemporary CRM relies on collaboration with the community to identify and protect resources from destruction. And sadly, it wouldn't surprise no one that at this point, archaeology is a lot less whip cracking, a lot more paperwork. Coordinating preservation work across multiple jurisdictions and different realms of legality, like housing, means a lot of people working in the field have to become experts in things like residence law and urban planning, particularly when urban development threatens to encroach on one of these areas, and they have to figure out how they can, do courtroom maneuvering or file government briefs to stop it rather than punch Nazis, which is such a huge bummer. Sadly, even this podcast's favorite Indiana Jones line has evolved with the times. As conversations around repatriation of cultural items in museums continue, the idea that any artifact belongs in a museum is itself under question. Stacy Camp, who works at Michigan State University, told Smithsonian, the "it belongs in a museum" mentality has resulted in archaeological repositories being overrun with artifacts and even ceasing to accept collections. Some archaeologists today employ a no collection or repatriation policy in their work.
I was just talking with somebody about that with the wreck of the Titanic, about the complicated debate around because the wreck is deteriorating, and in the next 10, 15 years, it's going to start collapsing in on itself. And because right now, the only things you're able to salvage are in the debris field and not anything from inside the ship. But they really want to be able to, I think the artifact that is up for debate now is trying to salvage the Marconi wireless system, which was used to call for help that night, and it's in a relatively accessible place and could be removed from the wreck. But it's in the last decade or so, the Titanic has gone from being history where the survivors were alive and their parents died on it and things like that to sort of transitioning into, I don't know what the term is, history where there are no more living witnesses to it, and it's become something where the kind of skittishness to take items from it is starting to decrease because the people who can bear witness to it firsthand are no longer here. And it's become something like, you look at something like Pompeii, where obviously people died there, but preservation becomes the kind of the more critical focus than respect for the dead, which is, again, a whole issue that I don't really want to debate on here. But that's interesting to me that the whole notion of maybe it doesn't belong in a museum, which is something that I need to stop and think about more, because I know that's my go-to. I collect all sorts of weird little bits of historical ephemera, and I'm probably bordering on being a hoarder at a certain point.
It's true, but you're not traveling to remote locations and stealing them out of
and taking it from people. Yes, that is true. But that is a very important. I remember I studied abroad in London, and our dorm was not far from the British Museum, and there were. I think actually, I remember there were a few pedestals of things that were like, we actually sent with a little note on it that said, we actually sent this back to where we found it so that they could enjoy it for a bit, but it will be back soon, which I thought was at least a step in the right direction.
One of the biggest changes to the field is even the notion of who or what an archaeologist looks like. Alexandra Jones, who's the founder of Archaeology in the Community, which is a DC area nonprofit, told the Smithsonian, archaeology is dominated by women. White women have taken it over. And she said, people don't usually expect me, as an African-American female, to show up to these events. So I guess Phoebe Waller-Bridge in the new one is more true to life than we would have thought. Some of that new Indiana Jones movie focuses on the idea of Indy struggling to adapt to a modern world. It's a rich concept for a movie, how does an antiquities hunter become an antique? And it's kind of why I don't care for those movies or the Crystal Skull one, because, I talked earlier about getting that kind of what we call the whiz-bang feeling from Raiders, and that's why I prefer to think of this character and all of that as the last shot in Last Crusade, where they're all riding off into the sun, literally riding off into the sunset. The platonic ideal of an adventurer that dates back to a time when the world had completely moved on from adventurers even being a thing. I mean, that's the amazing thing about this, right? This is created as a throwback, a consciously backward-looking character and consciously backward-looking franchise by the late 70s, at which point, were there places still left to adventure to? All of these concepts got so much more thorny and so much more complicated, and that's the real joy of this movie is how, and the first three movies, is how pure that they remain. So that's my final thought.
Well said.
I didn't even have a joke.
But are they stored in the Library of Congress? In other words, do these movies belong in a museum?
I don't think this one is actually in the Library of Congress. Oh. I think it's in AFI.
Well, then you got to say it. It belongs in museum.
It belongs in the Library of Congress. Folks, this has been Too Much Information. Thank you for listening. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time.
Too Much Information was a production of iHeartRadio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl,
with original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.